Today's conversation was really prompted by lots of questions that you get about, well, how early is too early to begin positioning? And clearly there's a lot of pushback within organizations to do it too early. So we're going to debate that idea that there's ever a time that's too early to be thinking about positioning. So one of the things that we always discuss internally is the idea that it's a little bit like that kind of, that cliche, that kind of false cliche that Eskimos have 180 words for snow. Of course, in English, we have lots of different words to describe snow as well. Powdery, dry, slushy. All of those things are part of our vocabulary. But to a baby, of course, it's all the same thing. It's all just snow. So the increasing sophistication of the way that we think about snow applies to positioning too. Positioning isn't always the same. And one of the easiest ways to break this down is into, well, what's it for? What's positioning for? And therefore, when is it too early to be thinking about doing it? Our suggestion is that phase 1 is the ideal time to begin to think about it. Phase 2 is critical. Phase 3 is important, and then maybe we'll come on to talk about repositioning at the end and whether and when it's ever the right time to do that. So the first question is really what's positioning for, and how do we begin to think about it? So how early is too early to think about positioning? So let's go back to the basics. Well, what is positioning for? Good positioning is something that you should be able to study in your phase 3. And of course, that seems self-evident probably to those of you watching this live stream. If you don't study your positioning in phase 3, all of the rest of what you want to do to talk about your drug, to differentiate your drug, to get the value demonstration that you want to be able to achieve, needs to happen within your phase 3. There's no point doing a boring phase 3 and then hoping somehow that you can differentiate with nice ads once you've got there. Because you've got to study it in phase 3, this value proposition of your drug, there's no point waiting until then to begin to position it. And that seems obvious, right? It seems self-evident. But so often we get called in to do positioning when the phase 3 is already underway and people are planning for launch. And I think that gives you some hint of the problem of positioning and the way it's understood. If it's understood to be only about communications, of course, you're going to arrive at that problem because other people will decide what drug you're going to get, and then you're going to decide how to describe it and how to communicate it. But of course, if you come back to our definition of positioning, which is that it's something that you should be able to study, something that you should be able to put into your label, well, of course, phase 3 is too late. You need to have studied it before that, so that your phase 3 is really the most useful thing you can do. Positioning is always important. And in fact, there is no choices that are made within early phase, within kind of phase 1, 2A, 2B, that don't impact your positioning. We kind of discussed this before. But the point of positioning changes by phase. And of course, that is where we get into some of the nuances of what we mean by positioning. Positioning at phase 1 doesn't involve a statement, but it does involve coming up with a concept of your drug. By definition, should really be about possibilities. So where could this agent go? And of course, you theoretically have a putative proof of mechanism at phase 1, and it's made the leap over the wall into the clinic because of some suggestion about how the drug works. But as we discussed the last time around, there are so many choices still to make on endpoints, patient populations, the disease that you're going to study, the stage, the severity. So much of what you need to know at this point is unknown. So it's very easy to understand the market as it is today. Much harder to think about the market in 5-10 years' time, which is really when your phase 1 asset is likely to be hitting the market. So one of the worst things to do is to start to try to understand the market opportunity, because guarantee you won't know that. Trying to understand what your drug can do, though, and giving yourself some options to take forward, that's really the point of positioning, and to try to understand really, well, where would we differentiate? And remember, I used this example last time of a product that maybe hits a cognitive endpoint. Well, let's say when you have this mechanism, that one of the things that you'd like to understand is, could it hit neuroplasticity? Could it hit some of the behavior that we see within dementia? Could it be Alzheimer's? Could it be mixed dementia? Is it Alzheimer's specific as a mechanism or not? And of course, each of those are choices about how and where you want to play within the marketplace. So there's no obvious answer. There's no obvious way to think about it. What you're doing essentially is positioning the drug for a future marketplace. So as soon as you start down the path of saying this is an Alzheimer's drug versus this is a mixed dementia drug or a vascular dementia drug or a Lewy body dementia drug, or this is about neuroplasticity within major depressive disorder, you're making choices. And of course, the more that you do at phase one to characterize and explore, the easier it becomes in phase two and phase three to be able to lock in some of those potential avenues for your drug. Any suggestion that isn't positioning is ridiculous, because of course you're choosing a place on the market, you're choosing a kind of something for someone to believe about your drug in the future. And of course, the rest of the exercise then becomes about proving that path. So as we begin to think about moving from phase one, which is really about exploring possibilities, exploring, well, what if we did this? What if we did that? And of course, there are lots of ways to do that. You can prototype your drug concepts very quickly at phase one and find out whether they have any validity. And then you can understand, well, what would the competitor set be if we were to get there? But of course, positioning in phase two is still not about the statement. So anyone that believes that positioning has a template, of course, is doing this wrong. We're really looking at the idea of the drug that you're going to take into phase three. And this is the most important time to look at it, because positioning may require you to look at endpoints, to look at scales, ways of calculating the difference that your drug provides over someone else's. Because as soon as you start playing somebody else's game, if you've got a drug that hits pain in a very different way, already you're starting to see the problem here. And it goes back to we started doing this kind of approach a long time ago, and there was a conversation that we had with someone at a large pharma company who was developing this pain drug, and essentially for heat pain. So TRPV1 antagonist that would hit the heat receptors, so would certainly work within a certain kind of pain. And we asked him, well, where is the drug at the moment? He said, oh, it's in a proof of concept. I said, oh, which proof of concept is it in? He said, oh, it's in a osteoarthritis proof of concept. Now, I'm not a scientist, but the question occurred to me immediately, well, just remind me, are there any of those receptors in the joints? No. Okay, so why study this drug in that proof of concept? Because actually you're not proving the concept of heat pain in that model. He said, well, because when we asked the regulators what a pain drug needed to prove, it needed to do a proof of concept in osteoarthritis. And of course, then the next question was, well, will it work there? And the answer was no. So you already know the answer to some of these things, which is finding the right place for your drug means not putting it into the wrong field, and then if it doesn't grow, thinking it's a bad drug. Positioning that drug actually could have had a lot of different opportunities to look at where heat pain drug could work, and then understand what the proof of concept there is, and then understanding how to take that forward into phase three. So think about the difference between a pain drug and a heat pain drug, or a drug that targets burns pain or something along those lines. Those are very different ideas of a drug. None of them need a statement. None of them need actually very much exploration, other than if we positioned a drug as a heat pain drug instead of a pain drug, A, it might be a more effective heat pain drug. B, there's definitely likely to be fewer of those by the time we get to the marketplace. And this is what the drug is good at. Because then, if you understand that at phase two, the great thing to do is to take that into phase three and then begin to prove that value proposition within a particular group of patients. So Positioning of phase two should be about establishing endpoints, patient populations, the segmentation, the value endpoints, comparators, label claims, business cases, and so forth. Because if you don't do this work at phase two, again, you're narrowing your options for later. If you only do one phase two or enough phase twos to give you a signal for phase three, actually by design, it tends to be a mini phase three coming back. But you think about each of these things, they're all important for positioning. This all defines what positioning is for. So who's it for? What's it for? Give me the value proposition. Give me the benefit. Give me the features that really connect you and why you're different in this place. The exploration of all of these things actually requires some room for maneuver. Phase two isn't a useful place to be gathering statistical significance, but it is a very useful place to begin to think about all of these things. So, and when we think about the business case, this kind of runway of opportunity, or your window of opportunity to be different than anyone else, has to begin within phase two. So, but again, we're not talking about a statement. So phase one is about understanding the potential positionings, the possibilities. Phase two is really about proving some of them and beginning to move on. So phase two is when positioning is clinically meaningful. And so rather than allowing the drug to just maximize its probability of technical success at phase two, this is the time to be finding out what kind of clinically meaningful drug you could take forward into phase three. And the idea is to when you get to the phase three decision, is that you're armed with all the evidence that you want about how to move it forward, whether that's dose, and think about again some examples from our past. We've looked at repositioning a drug, for example, that it always tried in oncology to prove that it was as efficacious as the drug that it was meant to replace. Actually, it turns out this drug had so many formulation advantages. What it was probably better at was maintenance rather than induction. But because it had always been studied at its maximum tolerated dose, you end up with what looks like a dirty drug, where if you come down from that maximum tolerated dose to something more interesting, to a kind of maintenance profile, a maintenance idea, you'd have had a much more successful drug by the time it got there. So this idea is critical, and really this is what you want to study at phase three. And because if you don't do that, what you're left with is, well, we don't know the answer to that question, therefore let's just carry on as we've gone forward. So things like dose response curves, things like patient populations, things like biomarkers, and a bunch of other things that could really help you narrow into that value proposition. And we come back to this idea that the label that has all of the things that you're going to need to put into your eventual positioning. It has the who, it has the what, it has the why, it has the where. It has all of those things. It has your comparators, has the kind of the people in whom this drug's really going to provide a benefit. And of course, the label is the only device that you have to talk from once your drug launches. So phase two is really when you set up those kind of opportunities to take drug forward. So we always describe phase two as the phase when blockbusters are made. Because after that, it's just about proving and launching those ideas. Really, phase three is a demonstration of the value that you found out about within phase two. And you go kind of hell for leather to prove it in phase three and then launch off that idea. So phase two is when you bake that kind of concept into the drug. And again, we used this model before. The difference between the molecule and the product and the brand is significant. The brand can come later. The brand can wait till phase three. As soon as you know what it is that you're launching, the externalization of your positioning can come later. But the idea of phase two is really about looking at and understanding what your product could be. It isn't about saying what it is. It isn't about communicating a message versus a kind of statement. All of those things don't matter. But the idea that you're going to understand where to position your drug eventually, that's positioning. It's not that's not a clinical decision. It should be a decision taken by the whole team. So as we come on to think about really what phase three is for, well, phase three is about communication, because let's assume you've done all of the exploration possible at phase one, that you've done the understanding of really where the drug works and what its value proposition could be at phase two. Equally important positioning jobs. Phase three is about communicating it and understanding, well, how best would we express what this drug is for. And this is where most people's ideas of positioning come in, which is, let's find the nicest thing to say about this drug. And by the time you begin your phase 3, you know which data you're going to collect. You know which patients you're looking at, you know which indication, you know everything that there is to understand about it. But you still have options for ways of describing how it works, you know, where it works, you know, what the value of all of that is. But it's still not necessarily about the benefits. So as you think about phase 3 communication, sometimes, of course, that's when you start to think about it. But by that point, someone's already decided on the endpoints, your formulation, your regimen, your indication, your comparators, and it probably wasn't the marketers. And I think this is critical. By phase 3, marketing tends to get involved earlier, positioning tends to be decided by somebody else. Now that's a problem, because the idea that the commercial value that you're looking to achieve in the future can be fixed, but when you're in phase 3 is wrong. You can't fix it if someone's already decided to study and then differentiate the drug up against a lot of different competition, hoping that your molecule is somehow better than everyone else's. So if you're positioning in phase 3, you're already restricted to what you can do, and then it comes down to the art and craft of positioning as communication. So it's absolutely about the communication. But bear in mind, mostly it's about the value proposition. So don't get distracted by the kind of features, benefits, ladders, all of that stuff. What you're trying to do is to communicate the absolute value of your drug. That's all positioning is, and to create a belief that your drug has a place, has a value that's different than anyone else's, that it's differentiated, that it does all of those things. So it's absolutely about communication when you get to that point. And communicating with power about where your drug fits, the value it brings, that, you know, is fundamental to the challenge of positioning. Now think about that. So the landscape of existing drugs, hopefully, by the time that you get there, landscape of existing drugs, landscape of potential competitors, you have to find a way to express that. And I guarantee you that the template is a waste of time. It's an artifice introduced by people who should know more about this than they do. And there's no magic to any of the templates. People spend so long worrying about, should it have this and two and all those other things in it. There's no power to any of the templates. Positioning, great positioning, can fit into anyone's template. And we've seen some nonsense, I mean, there's some absolute nonsense, and bore you with the details of ideas like premise, promise, proof, which are horrible ideas which actually create the wrong kind of thinking. So premise, promise, proof is a bad idea. The templates that are used to demonstrate that, though, are equally irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether you start with to who, that, so that, all of those things. They're just ways of showing it when you get to the end so that everyone knows what they're looking at. The problem is that they tend to become recipe cards. People start to fill them out that way, so it tends to limit the thinking. So as soon as you put two at the top, physicians who want to do the best for their patients, that kind of thing is the natural result of having a template where those things are written down. If you have a great idea, you can fill that out. It's typing. If you don't have a great idea, it becomes wordsmithing, and that's the biggest problem in phase 3 is the wordsmithing kind of magnet. The idea that somehow we're going to play with words, we're going to word think our way to a positioning. So, and it's really easy to create a statement that doesn't have any positioning in it, or has 5 or 6 different positionings in it. That's the biggest problem with most templates, is that the so that tends to call for a benefit. The that tends to describe how the drug works, or what happens if they're the same thing. So it unnaturally pulls apart some of the ideas that sit within the ways that you communicate your drug. So, and then the worst thing that we see happening, and if you follow the kind of McKinsey sort of nonsense through, which is that they ask physicians today what they think about what the TPP looks like to them and where it would fit within their current mindset. Forget the idea that positioning is supposed to be a space in the mind of the customer that you want to occupy at some point in the future. They ask them today. Then the worst thing that happens within all of those exercises is that they commission more market research to then wordsmith to death the positioning statement. Well, guarantee you what happens is that you end up polishing off any rough edges, and those rough edges may be where the thing has its potency. It may be where the kind of real kind of magnetic component of your positioning might sit. So the words tend to get compromised down. No one's ever seen a positioning statement, so when you're asked to look at one, you answer as if you were doing an English exam. It's not a, you're not doing this with any kind of sense of, this would be motivational to me. It's like, I like this word better than this word, therefore I'm going to alter it in that way. And of course, that tends to be what happens in most internal workshops when we're looking at positioning, is the words tend to get watered down so that, we make the best pizzas turns into we provide family experiences. Those kinds of things tend to happen. So if anyone says they should be testing positioning statements, first of all, what are they testing them against? So do they have two ideas that are being tested together, or is there or are people just trying to improve with their understanding of English and their internal thesaurus how best to express the thing that's already written down? So think about what the statement is for. Usually it's a way of sharing things internally. It's not even a way of expressing the positioning. Certainly not a way to derive the positioning. It's not a recipe card. You can't fill it out that way and expect to see success. Written this before, the chance that any group of physicians can help you improve your positioning by wordsmithing it, something that only a group like McKinsey could have come up with. We start to think about the 180 words for positioning, and as you said, there's an awful lot of things that go into what positioning is. Is it benefits? Is it value? Is it is it a proposition? Is it a way of segmenting your audience? And then think about what it's for. And then you come to one of the biggest issues within positioning, which is the link between messaging and positioning. We've said it before, said it all the way through all of these live streams. Positioning is not messaging. So any suggestion that you can't say that should already be the wrong expression of how to say this. Positioning is about the future. It's about expressing some vision about where your product should be going. But so often you have people nodding along to that. Yeah, I understand that messaging isn't the same as positioning. Messaging isn't the same as positioning. Positioning isn't the same as messaging. But then you get to the point and you say, well, here's the positioning. People say, oh, but we don't know that. Or, yes, but we can't say that. Well, there's the biggest problem. There's a bridge between positioning and communications, but it's not a direct line. So you don't take the positioning statement out and start to say it. That's absolutely not what it's for. So we need to enhance this understanding that positioning is an internally referenced idea of where the drug is meant to go. Doesn't mean this is how you communicate it. Doesn't mean it's how you say it. And this is one of the biggest issues, because if it comes down to what you can say, you're always going to be limited by what you studied. And then you come back to this kind of problem, which is we didn't study that, we didn't look at this, we didn't look at that patient population, we didn't look at that claim. So positioning at that point can only ever be this kind of tiny little thing that's left as a result of all the things that you chose to study. So positioning and messaging are wholly separate, wholly different things. And if you think about all the things that we capture here, the value demonstration, if you believe that your drug's worth X number of dollars at some point in the future, and your comparator is worth X, divided by 10, well, somehow you've got to find that place where that elasticity of value starts to make a meaningful difference, and you have to be able to express it. So come back, we think about on market, the things that you can say are entirely based on what you chose to study. So what you have in the label here at phase, at launch, was a product of your decision for what to study in phase 3. Your choice of what to study in phase 3 was constrained and restricted by what you chose to study in phase 2. So the idea that positioning is something that you can do here, well, of course it isn't, because all the things that you're going to want to be able to play with at this point were decided all the way back here at phase 2. So positioning matters. It matters that you do it early, because deciding what you want to be able to launch, the idea of your drug when you get here, has to have happened all the way back here. And it's entirely possible that you can do that. Most of the great positionings were created all the way back here. It's just that they weren't wordsmithed to death at that point. So we talk about this kind of positioning we've talked about it before, as this kind of, the kind of fundamentals of, sorry, I'll get this right. Get this in frame even, explore, decide, and prove. And of course, that is part of the, so explore a phase one, decide a phase two, which drug you're going to use, or give yourself enough information to decide with. And then phase three and onwards becomes about proving that value out in the world. The last thing I want to cover today is really the idea of repositioning, and because so often the people that have learned about positioning from a 50-year-old book think that you should never reposition. That's true if you've got a great positioning. So the question is, should you reposition if you don't? Absolutely, and do it today. Don't wait till next year, because I guarantee you that this problem that we have, that the positioning should influence the messaging, should do. They're not the same thing, but it should influence it. Is that you move beyond that into let's think about what's being communicated to your customers today. If you've got a poor positioning, let's say you've got 5 ideas in your positioning statement, let's say that it doesn't say anything, or it really wasn't derived very well. If you're using that as the basis for your messaging, where people tend to hear the stories that are made up, and if the positioning isn't tight enough, what happens is your ad agency, your reps, your PR company, they all hear what they think the positioning is about, and then they tell a different story. So you've got this extrapolation, this kind of exponential growth of stories that are being told based off this positioning, which wasn't very tight. Sometimes you get back what the market has been told, which is, an undifferentiated story that was nicely wordsmithed to death, but doesn't mean anything. You get that back, and then people say, so I don't understand where I would use your drug, or why I would use your drug, or that I would use it instead of a competitor. And of course, if that is what's coming back, is that people don't see the difference, if they look the same on all of the attributes, but one stands out because of some passive real-world evidence, you don't have a positioning. So the question is, should you ever reposition a drug? Absolutely, you should reposition a drug if that's what the message that's coming back. The idea that it might just be taking time to get there, well, possibly, but how long do you want to give it? So thought experiment, if you have a positioning that's working or that's not working, the only way to find out is to offer up alternative positionings to the marketplace, and understand which one will be more compelling, which one will give you a niche, a foothold, a segment to win within. So you should always be open to repositioning. If you've got a good, strong positioning, don't reposition. Avastin didn't reposition over 15 years. Cymbalta, a bunch of other drugs, Lipitor, didn't reposition over its time, but because they had a great positioning to launch from. If you are somehow stuck with a traditional template that doesn't really say anything, should you be repositioning? Answer is yes. So whatever the kind of those folks that teach launch readiness and marketing excellence say, the reality is you should reposition as soon as you can if you don't think this positioning is working very well. There are no rules. There's only a discipline, and this is where we come back to this 180 words for positioning, if you like, that as soon as you understand the discipline of positioning, you can start breaking some rules, but you've got to know the rules to be able to break them. And if all you've ever learned is one way of doing it, I guarantee you won't be able to use that knowledge productively going forward. So come to the end of the time, the kind of the big idea is positioning at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 are all important, and they don't all look the same. It is positioning though. So the idea that trying to understand where your drug is going to win is part of the job at phase 1, phase 2. It isn't throwing it into a field and hoping. It's absolutely about the idea of understanding where your drug can win, and positioning off the strength of that. So I'll bring my dog in. So we'll do a few more of these. I'd be interested in your thoughts on which subjects to cover in a little bit more depth as we go forward. So thanks for watching.